He cataloged the past, every page, every watermark, every ghost locked behind glass. Then a black card appears, an address, a night in Venice, one line that shouldn't belong in an archive. History is not read, it is felt. They promise a new method, live the lives inside the pages, feel their longing, their shame, their secret joys. He will be offered a choice: keep one perfect story, or learn to map 1,000 whispers. The Curator's collection presents The Cartographer of Whispers.
Part 1. The Invitation. The vellum was cool beneath the nitrile of his gloves, a specific coolness that spoke of its journey. 400 years old, dispatched from a Sienese monastery, and now resting on a gray felt cradle in the climate-controlled heart of the Institute. Edward Price traced the ghost of an illumination with his fingertip, the gilding long flaked away to a faint chemical memory. His report would note the specific watermark in the rag paper, the iron gall ink's particular corrosion pattern, the ghosting of text from a palimpsest beneath. It was a flawless authentication. A small, sharp thrill of professional victory settled in his chest, clean and sterile as the air he breathed. He logged the manuscript's details into the digital catalog, his keystrokes a quiet, rhythmic tapping in the cathedral-like silence of the room. Accession number 7B411. Condition: stable. Provenance: verified. Another ghost safely interned in its archival tomb. And then, as it always did, the satisfaction curdled. The thrill evaporated, leaving behind the familiar, hollow ache. He preserved the bodies of history, the brittle paper skins and faded ink bones, but the life within them was something he could only ever observe through layers of academic detachment and sanitized procedure. He was the world's most meticulous mortician, and his own life was a reflection of his work, Spartan, ordered, and devoid of uncatalogued emotion. That evening, the ache followed him from the archive to a fundraising gala at the home of one of the Institute's primary patrons. It was a world of soft lighting, hard opinions, and the polite clinking of ice in glasses. Edward stood near a towering bookshelf, a prop in a scene he could observe but never truly join. A woman in a shimmering dress approached him, her smile bright and brittle. "Edward, I read your latest paper on Carolingian script reforms. Utterly fascinating," she said, her eyes already scanning the room for a more important guest. "You make it all sound so definitive." "The goal is clarity, of course," Edward replied, his own voice sounding distant to his ears. "Of course," she echoed, patting his arm. "Keep up the good work. Someone has to keep track of all that dust." She laughed, a sound like tiny bells, and drifted away, leaving him in her wake of expensive perfume. Dust. That's what it was to them, an amusing collection of curiosities. He looked at the faces in the room, alive with ambition, gossip, and desire. They were creating their own chaotic, messy histories right here, tonight, with every whispered secret and calculated glance. He, meanwhile, was merely the custodian of the ashes they would all eventually become. He felt a wave of profound disconnection, a feeling of being hermetically sealed away from the raw, vibrant, and painful business of living. He left without saying goodbye. It was this quiet hum of desperation that made the Venetian acquisition so unsettling the next day. It arrived in a crude wooden crate, smelling of salt and something vaguely organic, a stark intruder in his world of purified air. Inside a folio that had been sealed with a brittle wax disc, his fingers found the anomaly. A card, thin but impossibly rigid, its surface a matte black that seemed to drink the light. He stripped off his gloves, a shocking breach of his own protocol. Embossed in the center was a shifting crest, a labyrinth that was also a keyhole. Below it, a single sentence: "History is not read, it is felt." Beneath that, an address in Venice and a time, 9 o'clock in the evening, just 3 days from now. Edward spent the rest of the day trying to debunk it. A prank by a colleague? Impossible. He had unsealed the folio himself. A marketing gimmick? The feel of the card, its sheer quality, suggested something far more exclusive. That night, in the curated quiet of his apartment, the words echoed. "It is felt." He looked at his collection of framed historical maps, their coastlines so certain, so definitive. They were lies of omission, he realized. They showed the land, but not the terror of the men who charted it, not the ache of the wives who waited for them, not the taste of salt on their lips. For 2 days, the card was a splinter in his mind. He would be cataloging a Civil War soldier's letter, and the phrase would superimpose itself over the cursive script. He would try to sleep and see the labyrinthine crest burned into the back of his eyelids. He tried researching the crest online, cycling through heraldry databases and occult symbology forums. There was nothing. It did not exist in his world of verifiable facts. It was an island of pure mystery. The card was a poison, dissolving the clean certainties of his life, and the only antidote, it seemed, was in Venice. The decision, when it came, was not a logical conclusion, but an act of quiet desperation. He booked the flight with the same meticulous precision he used to handle a fragile manuscript, a bizarre juxtaposition of his old self and this new, reckless impulse. He packed a single, Spartan carry-on bag: toothbrush, 2 changes of clothes, passport, and the black card, which he placed in the inner pocket of his jacket where he could feel its rigid outline against his chest. The airplane cabin was another sterile, climate-controlled tube, yet it felt different. It was a space of transition. As the aircraft climbed above the clouds, Edward looked down at the shrinking landscape, a neat grid of human intention. For the first time, he felt like he was escaping it. He was answering a summons. He was chasing a feeling. Venice was an assault. Stepping out of the Santa Lucia station was like stepping from a silent black and white film into a world of overwhelming, saturated color. The Grand Canal shimmered, a chaotic masterpiece of reflected light, churning water, and the wakes of countless boats. The air, thick with the sense of brine and diesel and baking pastries, was a shocking contrast to the filtered atmosphere he was used to. It was a city that did not care for preservation. It simply endured, wearing its decay like a velvet cloak. Finding the address was its own pilgrimage. His phone's map was a poor guide in the city's maze. He left the tourist throngs behind, plunging into the sestiere of Castello, a labyrinth of narrow cauli where laundry lines webbed the sky. More than once, he came to a dead end at a green-scummed canal, forced to retrace his steps, feeling hopelessly lost. This journey through the city's physical maze felt like a prerequisite, a test of his resolve. Finally, in an alley so narrow it squeezed the sky into a thin ribbon of bruised twilight, he found a door that matched the location. It was just a heavy, unassuming door of dark, water-stained wood. As his eyes adjusted, he saw it. Carved into the wood, so subtly it was almost invisible, was the crest, the keyhole, the labyrinth. It was not a sign for the public, but a sigil for the invited. He pushed. The door swung inward on silent hinges into a pool of darkness. It clicked shut behind him, the sound unnervingly final. He was in a small, square room. In its center stood a single, ornate desk of dark, polished wood, its surface bare and gleaming. The air was cool and smelled of beeswax and old paper. The desk was the room's only feature, a focal point demanding attention. Then a voice. It came from no discernible source, yet it was intimately close, smooth and genderless as polished glass. "Mr. Price, you found your way." Edward flinched. "Who are you? What is this place?" "This is a threshold," the voice replied, "and I am an inquiry. You are a man who dedicates his life to the echoes of the past. Tell me, have you ever truly felt any of it?" The question was a scalpel. "I am an archivist. My role is to preserve." "A beautiful cage," the voice mused, "but the door was always unlocked. We offer you access to a different kind of archive, a collection not of what happened, but of what it felt like." "The Whispering Archives," Edward whispered, "the scholar's ghost story now a terrifying reality." "Precisely. Access is yours, but it requires a different methodology. Surrender your control to truly understand." Surrender. The word was both a terror and a relief. He had navigated the labyrinth of his own doubt and the maze of the city to stand here. "I agree," Edward said, his voice barely a breath. There was a pause. "Place the invitation on the desk," the voice commanded softly. Edward reached into his jacket. His fingers closed around the rigid black card. He pulled it out and stepped forward. The polished surface of the desk reflected his face, pale and taut. He placed the card in the very center. It was an offering, a signature. The moment the card touched the wood, a low click echoed in the room. A section of the wall beside the desk receded into the shadows, revealing a doorway. From it flowed a scent that overwhelmed him, the smell of millions of pages, of leather, of dust, and of time itself. And with it came another sound, a sound he now realized had been there all along, just beneath the silence. It was the sound of whispers. Part 2. The Exhibition. The doorway did not lead into a room, but into an abyss that smelled of ages. Edward stepped through, and the world he knew fell away. He stood on a wrought iron balcony overlooking a space so vast it defied the physical constraints of the building that contained it. Tiers of dark, polished wood soared into a gloom that swallowed the light. each one packed tight with a chaotic multitude of books, scrolls, folios, and parchment sheets. It was a labyrinth built of paper and dust, a vertical city of forgotten thoughts. The architecture was impossible, a fever dream of spiraling staircases, bridges that led to nowhere, and balconies that hung suspended in the scented air. And the whispers, they were not a sound in his ears, but a vibration in the bones of his skull, a constant, sibilant chorus, the psychic residue of every secret, every confession, every dying declaration stored in this place. It was the sound of history itself, stripped of context and chronology, a raw and overwhelming torrent of human experience. A figure emerged from the shadows on the balcony. It was a person of indeterminate gender, pale and dressed in a simple, dark tunic. They did not speak. They did not need to. Their movements were spare and precise, their face a mask of serene neutrality. This was the attendant, a living piece of the archive's machinery. The attendant beckoned with a single, elegant gesture, and Edward, feeling like a child in a forest of giants, followed. They led him not to a reading room, but to a small, secluded carrel overlooking the central void. A single item rested on the desk, a small, leather-bound diary, its lock elegantly sprung. Edward sat, his earlier trepidation momentarily eclipsed by the familiar pull of an artifact. He opened it. The script was a coded variant of 18th century Italian, a simple substitution cipher he broke in minutes. The words that emerged were not of trade or politics, but of a desperate, clandestine passion. It was the diary of a young noblewoman, betrothed to a powerful doge, but secretly in love with a penniless artist. She wrote of waiting for him in a shadowed alcove during a masquerade, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The text was a tapestry of sensory detail. Edward read of the slick, cool feel of a black silk domino mask against her skin, the heavy scent of neroli perfume she had applied to her wrists, the chilling draft from a stone window that promised the arrival of both her lover and her ruin. He transcribed the translation onto a fresh sheet of paper, his own hand steady, but the words left a residue in his mind. When he finished, the attendant reappeared. Without a word, they led him from the carrel to a small stone alcove, identical to the one described in the diary. It was empty save for a simple wooden chair. A small, dark vial and a folded piece of black silk rested on the seat. On the wall, a single instruction was written on a small placard: contextualize, wait. He felt a surge of intellectual indignation, a comforting, familiar shield. This was absurd, a theatrical game. Yet he had agreed. Hesitantly, he uncorked the vial of neroli oil and dabbed a drop onto each wrist. The scent was potent, alien. He picked up the silk, its coolness a surprise against his skin, and tied the mask over his eyes. The world vanished. Plunged into darkness, his other senses flared. The neroli scent was a sweet, cloying cloud. He could feel the specific texture of the stone against his shoulder, could feel a faint, cool draft snake around his ankles. His analytical mind fought back, trying to keep its footing on the slippery stone of suggestion. Olfactory suggestion, it catalogued. Temperature fluctuation. auditory pareidolia. The whispers of the archive began to change, to coalesce into the distant, ghostly sound of string music. Pareidolia, his mind insisted, even as the melody became clearer, a sad, sweet waltz. He could almost hear the murmur of a crowded party just beyond the stone. His heart began to beat with a strange, unfamiliar rhythm. It was a frantic, hopeful beat, a young woman's anticipation. Auto-suggestion, his mind screamed, a desperate final defense. But the feeling, the raw, terrifying, vibrant feeling of waiting for a secret lover was no longer a historical fact he had read. It was a living current in his own blood, and his body did not care for his mind's protests. After an eternity that was perhaps only 20 minutes, the attendant led him from the alcove. Edward felt disoriented, his mind a battlefield between his rational self and the phantom emotions he had just experienced. They did not take him to another document. Instead, he was guided to a small, bare room containing nothing but a narrow cot. The attendant gestured to it, then retreated, closing the door softly behind them. He was alone. He sat on the edge of the cot, the scent of neroli still clinging to his skin like a stain. He felt profoundly violated. His inner world, the one place he had absolute, meticulous control, had been trespassed upon, its furniture rearranged. It was a trick, he told himself, pacing the small room. A meticulously engineered illusion using sensory deprivation, suggestion, and stagecraft. But the explanation felt hollow, an academic paper written about a hurricane. It described the mechanics, but missed the terrifying power. The feeling of it, the thrill of that illicit anticipation, had been more real than anything he had felt at the patron's gala. The memory of it was shameful, a betrayal of his own rigorous intellect. And yet, it was also thrilling. He stopped pacing and looked at his own hands, half expecting to see them changed. He felt a profound sense of self-disgust, but beneath it, a new and dangerous curiosity was taking root. He considered trying to find a way out, to hammer on the door and demand his release. But the thought of returning to his old life, to the dust and the silence, now seemed like a far greater imprisonment. He lay down on the cot, but did not sleep. He waited, caught in a terrible limbo, his own anticipation for what came next now mingling with the ghost of the noblewoman's. Hours later, the attendant returned. Edward followed them deeper into the labyrinth, down a narrow, winding staircase into the colder, damper levels of the archive. The air here smelled of earth and mildew. They stopped at a heavy oak door bound in iron. The cell inside was small, stone, and bare. The artifact for this session was a collection of unbound parchment sheets, confessions from a defrocked priest in the early 17th century. The language was a manic mix of ecclesiastical Latin and vulgar Italian, detailing his secret flagellant rituals. The words writhed on the page, a desperate battle between physical agony and spiritual ecstasy, faith and blasphemy. Edward's hands felt unclean as he translated the text. When he was done, the attendant gestured to the center of the cell, where a rough woolen robe lay on the flagstones. The instruction on the wall was stark: understand his penance. This time, the resistance was a cold wall of fear. This was not just sensation, but degradation. He remembered the feeling of control he had in his sterile, white-gloved world. To do this would be to abandon it completely. But the memory of the feeling in the alcove, that spark of borrowed life, was a powerful lure. What other truths were hidden in these depths? He stripped and pulled the coarse robe over his head. The wool was an abrasive torment. He knelt on the cold stone floor, the sharp chill seeping into his knees. The attendant placed his translation before him and closed the heavy door. He began to recite the prayers. His mind fought against the blasphemous Latin, trying to hold on to the clinical detachment of the translator. But the rhythm of the words, combined with the constant low-grade pain from the robe and the cold floor, began to work on him like a drug. His carefully constructed walls began to crack. A phrase from the text about divine abandonment triggered a sudden, vivid memory of his own. His father turning away from him in disappointment after he'd chosen a life in academia over the family business. The priest's written agony over his broken vows merged with Edward's own deep, unacknowledged shame over a past plagiarism in a graduate school paper, a secret he thought long buried. The historical figure's crisis of faith became a vessel for his own lifetime of suppressed guilt. He was no longer just reciting, he was confessing. A sob ripped from his throat, a raw, animal sound of grief and release that echoed in the tiny cell. He had been cracked open. He did not know how long he knelt there. When the attendant finally opened the door, Edward could barely stand. He was led back to his cell, his mind a wasteland. This time, there was no fight. He collapsed onto the cot, his body aching, his spirit scoured. There was no more analysis, no more indignation. There was only a vast emptiness and a terrifying new craving. He curled on his side, his mind replaying the ecstatic release he had felt in the stone cell. It was a feeling of terrible purity. He, a man who had lived his life in shades of gray, had been allowed to feel in absolute black and white, and he wanted more. The horror of the realization was immediate. He was no longer a prisoner of the exhibition. He was its addict. The final summons came. He rose from the cot without hesitation. He felt a strange lightness, a sense of purpose. He was ready for the final dose. He was led upward, back into the warmer levels, to a lavishly appointed chamber dominated by a large bed draped in dark red velvet. Soft cello music played from a hidden source. The artifact was a single, unsent letter from a notorious Venetian courtesan spy to the official she had just ruined. Edward read it, but this time he was not a translator or even a subject. He was a student, analyzing a master's technique. He recognized the methodology instantly. The curated environment, the promise of hidden knowledge, the breaking down of the will through escalating acts of submission. It was the curator's own playbook. The courtesan described how she turned herself into a perfect object of desire to unlock a man's soul. Edward looked around the room and understood that he, too, had been made into a perfect object, a perfect receptor, his psyche systematically emptied to make room for the data the curator wished to pour into it. The attendant approached, holding a simple black blindfold. The instruction, etched on a small silver plaque by the bed, was the most succinct yet. Become the artifact. There was no resistance left. He lay down on the velvet, the fabric cool and heavy against his back. As the attendant fitted the blindfold, a sense of profound calm settled over him. He was a vessel waiting to be filled. The whispers of the archive rushed into the vacuum. His own memories began to merge and flow with the lives he had inhabited. He remembered his mother's perfume, and it became the noblewoman's neroli, a scent of dangerous promise. He recalled the sting of a childhood failure, and it fueled the priest's search for penance. He felt the courtesan's cold triumph as he recalled his own small, secret victories of academic conquest, the layers of his own life, the sterile archives, the man named Edward Price, peeled away like dry parchment. The boundary between observer and participant did not just blur, it shattered. He was not just feeling their history, he was remembering it as his own. In that velvet darkness, he finally achieved the profound, all-consuming connection he had always craved. It was a feeling of terrible, transcendent beauty, and it did not break him. It remade him.
Part 3. The Unveiling. Consciousness returned not as a sudden jolt, but as a slow tide rising in a quiet bay. Edward was alone. The sad, solitary notes of the cello had faded, leaving behind a silence so absolute it felt like a presence. He sat up on the velvet bed, feeling not broken, but integrated. The sensory ghosts of the exhibitions were no longer phantoms haunting him. They were new limbs he was learning to control. He sat perfectly still, testing them. He focused on the memory of the neroli oil and could conjure its sweet, cloying scent in the back of his throat. He focused on the cold stone of the cell and felt a sympathetic ache begin in his knees, a feeling he could summon and dismiss at will. It was a new internal musculature.
The pale attendant entered, their movements as silent as ever. Edward met their gaze, and for the first time saw a flicker of something in their neutral expression, a hint of appraisal, of professional respect. They were no longer a guard or an acolyte. They were a colleague. The attendant offered a single, deliberate nod and gestured for him to follow. The walk back through the labyrinth was a revelation, a journey he took with the deliberate steps of a connoisseur. He stopped before a tall shelf of 16th century Spanish shipping logs bound in cracking leather. The old Edward would have seen water damage and iron gall corrosion. The new Edward closed his eyes and inhaled, letting the whispers of the place wash over him. A cascade of sensation flooded his mind, the distinct phantom taste of salt and cheap cask-aged rum on his tongue. He felt the subtle rocking motion of a ship at sea. In his mind's eye, he saw a cramped, candle-lit cabin, the wood dark and sweating with humidity, and beneath it all, a sharp, specific pang of longing for the scent of orange blossoms in a sun-baked Andalusian village. It was not a generic feeling of homesickness. It was his, the long-dead captain's, and it was as real as the floor beneath Edward's feet. He moved on. He paused again before a sealed glass case containing Victorian mourning jewelry. He focused on a small, intricate locket of woven human hair. The whispers here were different, sharper. A physical ache bloomed in his chest, so sudden and profound it almost made him gasp. It was the specific pain of a future stolen, the image of a young woman's face, pale in the gaslight of a London sick room, superimposed over his vision for a half-second. The grief was a perfect, cold, multifaceted thing. He analyzed it not with sadness, but with aesthetic appreciation for its purity. Further on, he came to a towering stack of uncatalogued folios from the French Directorate. The old Edward, the man of gloves and archival foam, would have been horrified by their precarious state. The new Edward felt an irresistible impulse. He reached out with a bare hand, his movements fluid and confident, and ran his fingertips over the dusty spine of the topmost volume. The taboo was intoxicating. The information that flowed into him was instantaneous, far more efficient than sight. He felt a surge of bureaucratic frustration, the weary impatience of a long-dead clerk, the smell of his cheap tobacco, the grating sound of his persistent cough. It was all there, a torrent of pure, unmediated data. His entire life's work, the meticulous practice of reading words, seemed like a child's game, a clumsy and laughably primitive method for touching the past. Finally, the attendant led him to the archive's central rotunda. In the exact center, illuminated by a single focused beam of light, stood an ornate desk of black wood. On it, two objects awaited: a silver hand mirror and a large, freshly bound book. The attendant retreated into the shadows. Edward picked up the mirror. He studied his reflection not with shock, but with intense, critical focus. He tilted his head, watching how the light fell across the new, calm planes of his face. He consciously flexed the muscles around his jaw, marveling at the absence of the tension that had lived there for 30 years. He remembered the man who had stared back from his bathroom mirror in his apartment, that worried, hollowed-out creature, pinched with anxiety. He felt a wave of pity for that man, a detached sympathy for a subject whose suffering was now complete. He was not that man. This reflection, this stranger with the knowing, dangerous eyes, was his true self, unearthed at last. He sat down at the desk, the chair solid and real beneath him. He opened the book. The binding was of smooth black leather, the title embossed in silver, Edward Price. He turned the pages, not with horror, but with the cool satisfaction of an author reviewing his own work. He stopped at a passage describing his time in the cold cell. He read the words he had written in his own meticulous script, detailing the shame, the chattering teeth, the surrender to the rhythmic prayers. He analyzed the passage with the detached eye of an editor. He admired a particularly well-turned phrase describing his own humiliation, the way he had captured the precise moment his intellectual defiance had cracked. He felt a surge of immense artistic pride. This book was his masterpiece, an artifact forged from the raw material of his own soul. It was the only honest piece of history he had ever produced. Tucked into the last page was a note on the familiar black card, the curator's critique, a successful acquisition. The note concluded with the choice: take the book, his perfect, singular monument, and leave, or stay and become the master of this new art form, the Cartographer of Whispers. Edward leaned back in the chair, the light from above casting his face in stark relief. The choice was not about freedom versus captivity. It was about his art. He weighed the options with a new, cold clarity. To possess a single, perfect artifact, he thought, my name on it, a flawless testament to my transformation. It would be a treasure, but it would be a finite one, a story with an end. He looked out into the soaring darkness, at the endless shelves of sleeping souls. Or, he considered, to become the founder of a new genre, an entire gallery of such masterpieces, an endless supply of subjects, of raw material, endless stories to shape. The conflict was not about his future safety, but about his future legacy. He looked at the book, his first great work. He looked at the vast, silent archive, his new, unplowed field. He had found the meaning he craved, not in the dusty records of others, but in the power to create them from living flesh. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his hand. He held it over the desk, his shadow falling across both the mirror and the book. He was no longer a man who read history. He had become a place where history was made.
Thank you for lingering in the stacks with the Cartographer of Whispers. If you value these quiet tales, subscribe and join the Curator's Circle. Continue with the next tale in the Curator's collection. Until next time, keep listening.